We have the vehicle raised securely using a jack stand, and wheel chock placed behind the opposite rear wheel. We are working on the passenger front of this 2016 Toyota 4Runner, and the first thing that we're going to do now is remove the wheel using a 21mm socket and an impact gun. On these wheels, I specifically use a non-impact socket because it is very easy to damage this paint on the wheels, so that's why I use a thinner walled socket. Before I remove the brake hardware, I take notice of where everything's placed. You can see that this U part here is on the inside and underneath brake pad slide pin. And you can also see how this is installed. So I just go ahead and I remove this piece first, which then will allow me to tap out my slide pins. Before I take these off though, snag a picture of this so that if you're confused on how it goes back together, you can get back to it. The next thing that I do is I use a flathead screwdriver, and I'm going to pry between this pad and this rotor, and this pad surface here and this rotor, and that's going to decompress this 4-piston caliper. I wedge a screwdriver between the rotor and the metal portion of the pad, and I just press it back a little bit. So I'm just going to get this wedged in there and press it back. I'll just pry them back, and as I pry them back, it will release the grip of the caliper. So now that we have the calipers decompressed, we can go ahead and remove the pads, and we'll just grab this little clip here, and it has a small little prong that sticks into the hole of this pad. So we'll just pull this out, and you can just use a small screwdriver, and that pops out, and then we'll just turn that out of the way. And for the pad slide pins, you can just go ahead and lift up, which will remove the little locking portion. And when you have those out, you can just press through this small little metal lock piece and grab it and pull through. Now with a small hammer and punch, I'm just going to go ahead and start tapping through the pad slide pin. I'll do that on both top and bottom. Now if you have a little bit of difficulty, the bottom ones are always going to be a little bit more corroded. So sometimes what you can do is you can just hammer on the front to break loose that rust bond, and then come back to the rear and tap it through. If you are planning to replace the pads and rotors, you can spray a small amount of PB Blaster or rust penetrant into these little sleeves here, and that'll help you remove it. But if you are planning to reuse any of the brake components, you do not want to do that. So once we get it broken loose a little bit, we'll just go ahead and keep tapping it out. And the same thing with the top. Now, once you get the top to about this much out, what I do is I get a set of pliers, and I just hold the pliers closed gently against, and I'll pull it out. If I need an additional help, I'll just tap it out with a hammer. But typically wiggling it and pulling it will get it to come out. But if you need to, you can wiggle it and tap it with a hammer. And once you have both of the pad slide pins removed, you can just go ahead and pull the pads out like so. The next step is to remove this 12mm bolt, which is securing the brake hose to the steering knuckle itself. And then you'll go to the back and you'll go ahead and remove the two 19mm bolts that are holding the caliper assembly to the spindle as well and over top of the rotor. Now if you were just replacing the pads, you'll stop at this point and you'll go ahead and reassemble everything in reverse order. So now I'm just removing the 12mm socket, and then you can just wiggle this bracket off the knuckle, and now you have a little bit of freedom so that you can remove the caliper. So using my 19mm socket, I'll go ahead and remove the two bolts that are holding the caliper on. Now we're removing the lower 19mm bolt. And the next thing that I do is I thread my zip tie through this hole here, which is just above the bump stop on the control arm. And then I just move my caliper over and go through this front little top hole here and orient my zip tie in such a way that I can just go ahead and zip tie it to the suspension, up and out of the way. And now we have no tension on our hose or our wheel speed sensor. So now with an M8 by 1.25, I'll go ahead and hand thread this bolt in to the rotor. And then run it in. Which will break the rust. And that breaks the rotor loose from the surface. And with a wire brush, I'll just spin it over and knock loose any of the loose rust. Because you want to have a perfectly flat mating surface here so that you don't have any brake pulsation when you put it all back together. When you install your new rotor, make sure that you have clean hands or clean gloves so that you don't get any sort of oil or contaminants on there. You're going to have to clean that up if you do. With the rotor on, you can go ahead and start reassembling everything. So one little precaution I do is I put a small little dab of thread locker and then I reinstall all of these. Now we'll just go ahead and slide our pads in. Don't push them down too far or else you will have a hard time lining them up and through their side pins. So we know that this piece U here is on the bottom side. So what I do is I just go ahead and set this up before I put the slide pin in. U side down. Just going to tap this in. Light tap, and then the same thing for the top. Now we're going to take our little pad slide pin holder and we'll go ahead and get our holes in the back of the slide pin oriented in such a way that we can install this. So I'll go ahead and get one side on. And then I'll insert it into its little keeper. And then I'll very gently persuade it to go into the top. Try not to bend it too much so that it doesn't deform. And now those are locked. I'll go ahead and scrunch this into its hole in the pad. And that's on, and then I'll do the same for this side here. And I'll make sure that it sits above like such. So as you can see, that little keeper goes through the small hole that's in the back side of the brake pad slide pin. And then it just goes into this hole in the actual caliper. And now this one, you'll see how that's oriented. The U-shaped side is closer to the rotor, and those two little pieces that are sitting on top of the pad are what keep that in its location. And then that little hook goes into the hole right there. And that's how you set up your brake pads and your rotors.
These two arrows are pointing to where the clips need to be fully flush alongside of the pad. This current photo is not correctly or fully installed.
Now the last thing before you finish and put your wheel and tire back on, you'll go ahead and put your little bracket holder in place. And that is with a 12mm socket on that bolt. And we'll just run this all the way in and tighten it up.